ignoring tech is kind of no longer an option in the government. Big tech has been present in Washington, but big tech's interests are not only very different than kind of startup innovators' interests, but we think also kind of divergent from America's interest as a whole. If America is going to be America in the next 100 years, we have to get this right.
Yep.
Welcome back, everybody. We are very excited for this episode. We are going to be discussing a lot of hot topics. The theme of today's show is tech and policy and politics. And so there's just a tremendous amount of heat right now in the tech world about politics. There's a tremendous amount of heat in the political world about tech. And then we as a firm, and actually I and both Ben and I as individuals have been spending a lot more time in policy and politics circles over the last several months. And we as a firm have a much bigger push here than we used to, which Ben will describe in a moment. But we're going to go into quite a bit of detail. The big disclaimer that we want to provide up front for this is that we are a nonpartisan firm. We are 100% focused on tech, politics, and policy. We today in this episode are going to be describing a fair number of topics, some of which involve partisan politics. Our goal is to describe anything that is partisan as accurately as possible, and to kind of try to be as sort of fair-minded and representing multiple points of view as we can be. We are going to try very hard to not take any sort of personal political partisan position. So please, if you could grant us some generosity of interpretation in what we say. We are trying to describe and explain as opposed to advocate for anything specifically partisan. We advocate for tech policy topics. We do not advocate for other partisan topics. And actually, so yeah, on that theme, Ben, could you, we wrote a little while ago, you wrote a blog post about and published about our firm's engagement in politics and policy. We sort of laid out our goals and then also how we're going about it. And we are actually quite transparent about this. And so I was hoping maybe as an introduction for people who haven't seen that, if you could walk through what our plan and strategy is and how we think about this.
Yeah, it kind of starts with, why now? Why get involved in politics now? Historically, tech has been a little involved in politics, but it's been relatively obscure issues, H-1B visas, stock option accounting, carried interest, things like that. But now the issues are much more mainstream. And it turns out that, for most of kind of the software industry's life, Washington just hasn't been that interested in tech or in regulating tech for the most part. But starting kind of in the mid-2000s, as software ate the world and tech started to invade all aspects of life, ignoring tech is kind of no longer an option in the government, in that, they've seen it impact elections and education and everything. And they, I think policymakers really want to get in front of it is a term that we hear a lot. We need to be in front of these things this time, not like last time when we were behind the curve. And so tech really needs a voice, and in particular, little tech needs a voice. So big tech has been present in Washington, but big tech's interests are not only very different than kind of startup innovators' interests, but we think also kind of divergent from America's interest as a whole. And so that just makes it quite imperative for us to be involved, not only to represent the startup community, but also to kind of get to the right answer for the country. And for the country, this is, we think, a mission critical effort, because if you look at the last century of the world and you say, okay, why was America strong? And why was basically any country significant in terms of military power, economic power, cultural power in the last 100 years? And it was really those countries that got to the Industrial Revolution first and exploited it best. And now at the dawn of the kind of information age revolution, we need to be there and not fall behind, not lose kind of our innovative edge. And that's all really up for grabs. And really the kind of biggest way America would lose it, because we're still like, from a capitalistic system standpoint, from an education standpoint and so forth, from a talent standpoint, we're extremely strong and should be a great innovator. But the thing that would stop that would be kind of bad or misguided regulation that forces innovation elsewhere out of the country and kind of prevents us ourselves, America and the American government, from adopting these technologies as well. And kind of driving that, driving the things that would kind of make us, bad on tech regulation are first really, big tech, whose goal is not to drive innovation or make America strong, but to preserve their monopoly. We've seen that act out now in AI in a really spectacular way, where big tech has pushed for the banning of open source for safety reasons. Now, you can't find anybody who's been in the computer industry who can tell you that any open source project is less safe. First of all, from a hacking standpoint, and you talk about things like prompt injection and the new attacks and so forth, you would much more trust an open source solution for that kind of thing. But also for, a lot of the concerns of the US government about copyrights, where does this technology come from and so forth. Not only should the source code be open, but the data should probably also be open as well. So we know what these things were trained on. And, and that's also for figuring out what their bias is and so forth. How can you know if it's a black box? So this idea that, closed source would be safer, and big tech actually got this, some of this language into the Biden administration executive order, like literally on, like under the guise of safety to protect themselves, against competition, is really, really scary. And so that's kind of a big driver. The other kind of related driver is, I think, this combination of big tech pushing for fake safetyism to preserve their monopoly, and then a rather thin understanding of how the technologies work in the federal government. And so without somebody kind of bridging the education gap, they're very, very, we are as a country very vulnerable to these bad ideas. And we also think it's just a critical point in technology's history to get it right, because if you think about what's possible with AI, so many of our country's kind of biggest challenges are very solvable now. Things like education, better and more equal health care, just thinning out the bureaucracy that we've built and making the government easier to deal with, particularly, for kind of underprivileged people trying to get into business and do things and become entrepreneurs. All these things are made much, much better by AI. Similarly, crypto is really our best answer for, kind of getting back to delivering the internet back to the people and away from the large tech monopolies. It is the one technology that can really do that. And, if we don't do that, over the next 5 years, these monopolies are going to get much, much stronger. Probably some of them will be stronger than the US government itself. And we have this technology that can help us, get to this, dream of stakeholder capitalism and participation for all economically. And we could undermine the whole thing with poor regulation. And then finally, in the area of biology, we're at an amazing point in that if you look at the kind of history of biology, we've never had a language, just much like we never had a language to describe physics for 1,000 years. We didn't have a language to really model biology till now. The language for physics was calculus. The language for biology is AI. And so we have the opportunity to cure a whole host of things we could never, touch before, as well as kind of address populations that we never even did any testing on before and always put in danger. And, this again, you have big pharma whose interest is in preserving the existing system because it kind of locks out all the kind of innovative competition. And so for all those reasons, we've massively committed the flag and the firm to being involved in politics. So you've been spending a tremendous amount of time in Washington. I've been spending time in Washington. Many of our other partners like Chris Dixon, BJ Pandey have been spending time in Washington. We have like real actual kind of a lobbying capability within the firm, when we'll talk about that some more, but call it government affairs, but they're registered lobbyists and they're working to kind of work with the government and set up the right meetings and help us get our message across. And then we're deploying a really significant amount of money to basically pushing innovation forward, getting to the right regulation on tech that preserves America's strength. And we are not only committed to doing that this year, but for the next decade. And so this is a big effort for us. And we thought it'd be a good idea to talk about it on the podcast.
Yeah. Thank you. That was great. And then, the key point there at the end is worth double underlining, I think, which is long-term commitment. There have been times with tech specifically where there have been people who have kind of cannonballed their way onto the political scene, with, large, kind of bomb, sort of money bombs. And then, and maybe they were just single issue or whatever, but they're in and out, or, they're just in and out. They just, it was just like they thought they could have short-term impact. They then 2 years later, they're gone. We're thinking about that very differently.
Yeah. I mean, then that's why I brought up, the historical lens. We really think that, if America is going to be America in the next 100 years, we have to get this right.
Yep. Good. Okay. We're going to unpack a lot of what you talked about and go into more detail about it. So I will get going on the questions, which again, thank you everybody for submitting questions on X. We have a great lineup today. So I'm going to combine a bunch of these questions because there were some themes. So Jared asks, why has tech been so reluctant to engage in the political process, both at the local and national level until now? And then Kate asks, interestingly, the opposite question, which I find this juxtaposition very interesting because this gets to the nature of kind of how we've gotten to where we've gotten to. Kate asks, tech leaders have spent hundreds of millions lobbying in D.C., right? The opposite point. In your opinion, has it worked? And what should we be doing differently as an industry when it comes to working with D.C.? And so I wanted to kind of juxtapose these two questions because I actually think they're both true. And the way that they're both true is that there is no single tech.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Ben, to your point, there is no single tech. And so, and maybe once upon a time there was, and I would say, my involvement in political, kind of efforts and, in this domain started, 30 years ago. And so I've seen a lot of the evolution over the last 3 decades. And I was in the room for the founding of TechNet, which is one of the sort of legacy, kind of lobbying groups. John Chambers and John Doerr. So, so I've kind of seen a lot of twists and turns on this over the last 30 years. And I think, the way I would describe it, is, this is, as Ben said, so one is, look, they're just, was there a diversion? Was there a sort of a distinction and a real difference of view between big tech and little tech 20, 30 years ago? Yes, there was. It's much wider now. I would say that whole thing is really gapped out. The big tech, even big, Ben, you probably remember big tech companies in the 80s and 90s often actually didn't really do much in politics.
Yeah.
They didn't really have, probably like most famously Microsoft probably, Microsoft probably would, everybody at Microsoft during that period would probably say they had underinvested, kind of given what happened with the antitrust case that unfolded.
Yeah, actually the one issue we were united on was the stock option accounting, which, interestingly, and we were against Warren Buffett, and, Warren Buffett was absolutely wrong on it and won. And it's actually very much strengthened tech monopolies. So it, I think, did the opposite of what, people certainly in Silicon Valley wanted. And I think people, in Washington, D.C. and in America would have wanted was to, make these monopolies so strong and using their market cap to further strengthen their monopoly. Because we moved from stock options to, it's too esoteric to get into here, but let's just say, trust me, it was bad.
Yes. It was very good for big companies, very bad for startups. So, and actually that's another thing that actually happened in the 90s and 2000s is, so there's a fundamental characteristic of the tech industry, and in particular tech startups and tech founders, which and Ben and I would include ourselves in that group, which is we are idiosyncratic, disagreeable, iconoclastic people. And so there is no tech startup association. Like every industry group in the world, in the country has like an association that has like offices in DC and lobbyists and like major financial firepower. And these under names like, the MPAA in the music industry or the movie industry, and the RIAA in the record industry, and the National Association of Broadcasters, and, the National Oil and Gas Association, and so forth. So like every other industry has these groups that basically where basically the industry participants come together and agree on a policy agenda. They hire lobbyists and they put a lot of money behind it. The tech industry we've just never been good at actually, especially the startups. We've never been good at agreeing on a common platform. And in fact, Ben, you just mentioned the stock option accounting thing. Like that's my view of what happened at TechNet, which is TechNet was an attempt to actually get like the startup founders and the new, kind of the new dynamic tech companies together. But the problem was we all couldn't agree on anything other than basically there were two issues. We could agree on stock option expensing as an issue, and we could agree on carried interest for venture capital firms as an issue.
Yeah.
Carried interest tax treatment. And so they were basically what ended up happening was, again, my view, kind of TechNet early on got anchored on these, I would say, pretty esoteric accounting and financial issues, and just never had a view on, it could not come to agreement on many other issues. And I think a lot of attempts to coordinate tech policy in the Valley have had that characteristic. And then look, quite honestly, the other side of it, Ben, you highlighted this, but I want to really underline it. It's just like, look, the world has changed. And, up until 2010, I would say we're up around until about 2010. I think you could argue that, politics and tech were just never that relevant to each other. For the most part, what tech companies did was they made tools. Those tools got sold to customers. They use them in different ways. And so, how do you regulate it? Database software or an operating system or a word processor or a router.
Regulating a power drill or a hammer, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Exactly. Like, yeah, what are appropriate shovel regulations? And so it just wasn't that important. And then, look, this is where I think Silicon Valley deserves its share of blame for anything, whatever's gone wrong, which is as a consequence, I think we all just never actually thought it was that important, to really explain what we were doing and to be really engaged in the process out there. And then, look, the other thing that happened was, there was a love affair for a long time. There was a view that, there was just a view that like tech startups are purely good for society. Tech is purely good for society. There were really no political implications to tech. And by the way, this actually continued interestingly up through 2012. People now know of all the headlines that, social media is destroying democracy and, all these things that kind of really, kicked into gear after 2015, 2016. But, even 2012, like the narrative, social media had become very important actually in the 2012 election, but the narrative in the press was like almost uniformly positive. It was very specifically that social media is protecting democracy by making sure that certain candidates get elected. And then also, by the way, Obama, there were literally headlines from, very, newspapers and magazines today that are very anti-tech, that were very pro-tech at that point, because the view is tech helped Obama get reelected. And then the other thing was actually the Arab Spring. There was this moment where it was like tech is not only going to protect democracy in the U.S., but it's going to protect democracy all over the world. And, Facebook and Google were the catalysts, at the time were viewed as the catalyst for the Arab Spring, which is going to, of course, bring a flowering of democracy in the Middle East that has
it didn't work out that way, by the way.
Did not work out that way. And so anyway, the point is, like, it is relatively recent in the last 10, 12 years that it's just sort of just like everything has just kind of come together. And all of a sudden, people in the policy arena are very focused on tech. People in the tech world have very strong politics opinions. The media, weighs in all the time. And then by the way, none of this is a U.S. only phenomenon. We'll talk about other countries later on, but there's also a global, kind of thing. These issues are playing out globally in many different ways. I guess one thing I would add is like when I'm in, I do a fair amount in D.C. on the non-political side, and when I'm in, meetings involving national security or intelligence or civil policy of whatever kind, it's striking how many topics that you would not think are tech topics and end up being tech topics.
Yeah.
And so, and it's just because like when the state exercises power now, it does so through, with technologically enabled means. And then when citizens, basically resist the state or fight back against the state, they do so with technologically enabled means. And so there's sort of this, I was, sometimes say we're the dog that caught the bus on this stuff, right? Which is, we all wanted tech to be important in the world. It turns out tech is important in the world. Yeah. And then it turns out the things that are important in the world end up getting pulled into politics.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. On the second part of the question, I think that's like, why is tech been so ineffective despite pouring all the money in it? And I think there are like a few kind of important issues around that. One is, really arrogance in that I think, we in tech and a lot of the people who went in are like, oh, we're the good guys, we're for the good, and everybody will love us when we get there and we can just push our agenda on, kind of on the policymakers without really putting in the time and the work to understand the issues and the things that, you face as somebody in Congress or somebody in the White House, in trying to figure out what the right policy is. And I think that, we are coming at that from kind of our cultural value, which is we take a long view of relationships. We try never to be transactional. And I think that's especially important on policy because these things are massively complex. And so we understand our issues and our needs. And, but we have to take the time to understand, the issues of the policymakers and make sure that, we work with them to come up with a solution that is viable for everyone. And so I think that's thing one. I think tech's just been very bad on that. And the second one is I think that, they've been partisan where like it's been like not necessary or not even smart to be partisan. So people have come in with whatever like political bent, mostly kind of Democratic Party that they have, and like, okay, we're going to go in without understanding you and only work with Democrats because we're Democrats and this kind of thing. And I think, our approach is, look, we are here to represent tech. We want to work with policymakers on both sides of the aisle. We want to do what's best for America. We think that if we can describe that correctly, then we'll get support from both sides. And that's just a really different approach. So hopefully that's right. And hopefully we can make progress.
Okay, good. So let's go to the next question. So this is, again, a two-part question. So Sheen asks, in what ways do you see the relationship between Silicon Valley and D.C. evolving in coming years, particularly in light of recent regulatory efforts targeting tech giants? And we'll talk about TikTok later on. But there's been obviously big, there's big flashpoint kind of events happening right now. By the way, also for people who haven't seen, the DOJ just filed a massive antitrust lawsuit against Apple.
Yeah.
That the tech topics are very hot right now in DC. So how do we see the relationship?
By the way, that one's an interesting one of the things that I've talked about, which is, a lot of little tech, I think is very much in alignment with some of the things that the FTC is doing, but probably we would do it in a very different, against a different kind of set of practices and behaviors of some of the tech monopolies. And it just shows why like more conversation is important on these things, because, what we think is the kind of abuse of the monopoly and, what the lawsuit is, I would say are not exactly the same thing.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about that for a moment, because this is a good case study of kind of the dynamics here. So the traditional kind of free market libertarian view, is sort of very, very critical of antitrust, theory in general, and is certainly very critical of the, current prevailing antitrust theories, which are kind of more expansive and aggressive than the ones of the last 50 years, as shown in things like the Apple lawsuit and many other actions recently. And so, there's sort of a, for people in business, there's sort of a reflexive view that, basically says businesses should be allowed to operate. But then very specifically, there's this view, there are certainly people who have this view that basically says, any additional involvement of the political machine, especially the sort of prosecutorial machine in tech, it is invariably going to make everything worse in tech. And so, they sue Apple today, and maybe you're happy because you don't like Apple today because, they abused your startup or whatever. But like, if they win against Apple, they're just going to keep coming and coming and coming and do more and more of these. The opposing view, the opposite view would be the view that says, no, actually, the interests, to your point, the interests of big tech and little tech have actually really diverged. And that actually, if there is not actually strong and vigorous investigation and enforcement, and then ultimately things like the Apple lawsuit, actually these companies are going to get so powerful that they may be able to, really seriously damage, little tech, for a very long time. So maybe Ben, talk a little bit about how, kind of we think through that kind of, because we even debate this inside our firm. But then talk a little bit through about how to process through that, and then, what you think, and then also kind of where you think those lines of argument are taking us.
Yeah. So look, I definitely think, and by the way, right, I should full disclosure, when we were at Netscape, we were certainly on the side of little tech against big tech, and, Microsoft at that time had a 97%, market share on desktop. And, it was very, very difficult to innovate on the desktop. It was just, bad for innovation to have them, in that level of position of power. And I think that's happened on the smartphone now. particularly with Apple. I think the kind of the Epic case and the Spotify cases are really great examples of that, where you know I am fielding a product that's competitive with Spotify, and I am charging Spotify a 30% tax on their product. Like, that seems unfair. Just from like a consumer, like just from the standpoint of the world. And it does seem like it's using monopoly power in a very aggressive way. I think it's certainly against our interest and the interest of new companies for the monopolies to exploit their power to that degree. Like when the government gets involved, it's not going to be like a clean surgical, like, okay, here's exactly the change that's needed. But I also think, with these global businesses with tremendous lock-in, you just have to, at least have the conversation and say, okay, what is this going to do for consumers if we let it run? And we need to represent that point of view, I think, from the kind of small tech perspective.
Yeah, and the big tech companies are certainly not doing us favors right now. So, they're certainly not acting in ways that are pro startups. I think we could say as a general.
No, the opposite. Sure,
quite the opposite. One of my ideas I kick around a lot is it feels like companies. It feels like any company is either too scrappy or too arrogant.
Yeah.
But never in the middle.
Yeah. Like it's like people.
Right. You're either the underdog or you're the overdog, and there's not a lot of reasonable dogs.
Exactly.
Yeah. So there's an inherent tension there. It seems very hard for these companies to reach a point of dominance and not figure out some way to abuse it.
I also think you kind of touch on an important point, which is, we're, in representing little tech, we're not a pure libertarian, anti-regulatory kind of, force here. We think we need regulation in places. We certainly need it in drug development. We certainly need regulation in crypto and financial services. The financial services aspect of crypto is very, very important. It's very important to the industry that it be strong in America with a proper kind of regulatory regime. So we're not anti-regulation. We're kind of pro the kind of regulation that will kind of make both innovation strong and, the country strong.
Yeah, and we should also say, look, like when we're advocating on behalf of little tech, obviously there's self-interest, kind of as a component of that, because we're a venture capital firm and we back startups, and so there's obviously a straight financial interest there. I will say, I think, Ben, you'd agree with me. Like, we also feel like philosophically, like this is a very sort of pro-America position, very pro-consumer position. And the reason for that is very straightforward, which is, Ben, as you've said many times in the past, the motto of any monopoly is, what's the motto?
We don't care because we don't have to.
Right, exactly. And so
you probably experienced, if you've called customer service when one of these monopolies has, kicked you off their platform.
Yes, exactly. And so, it's just that there is something in the nature of monopolies where they have a, if they no longer have to compete, and if they're no longer disciplined by the market, they basically go bad. And then, how do you prevent that from happening? The way you prevent that is from forcing them to compete the way that they have to compete. In some cases they compete with each other, although often they collude with each other, which is another thing. Monopoly and cartel are kind of two sides of the same coin. But, really, it's, at least in the history of the tech industry, it's really when they're faced with startup competition. When the elephant has a terrier at his heels nipping at him, taking increasingly big bites out of his foot, like that's when big companies actually act. And when they do new things. And so without healthy startup competition, let's say there are many sectors of the economy where it's just very clear now that there's not enough startup competition because the incumbents that everybody deals with on a daily basis are just practically intolerable. And it's not in anybody's interest, ultimately, from a national policy standpoint, for that to be the case. Things can get bad where it's to the benefit of the big companies to preserve those monopolies, but very much not to anybody else's benefit.
Yeah, no, exactly. Which is, I would say, it's such a big impetus behind our kind of political activity.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, we'll keep going. In what ways do you, now we're going to future looking. So in what ways do you see the relationship between Silicon Valley and D.C. evolving in the coming years? And then specifically, and again, we're not going to be making partisan recommendations here, but there is an election coming up, and it is a big deal, and it's going to have both what happens in the White House and what happens in the Congress is going to have big consequences for everything we've just been discussing. So how do we see the upcoming election affecting tech policy? And Ben, why don't you start?
Yeah, well, I think there are, several issues that end up being really important to kind of educate people on now, because whatever platform you run on, as a congressperson or as the president, you want to kind of live up to that promise when you get elected. And so a lot of these kind of positions that will persist over the next 4 years are going to be established now. I think in, crypto in particular, we've been very active on this because there's, we have a big kind of donation to something called the Fair Shake PAC, which is kind of work on this and just identifying for kind of citizens, like, okay, which politicians are on what side of these issues? Who are the kind of just flat out anti-crypto, anti-innovation, anti-blockchain, anti-decentralized technology candidates, and like, let's at least know who they are so that we can tell them we don't like it, and then tell all the kind of people who agree with us that we don't like it. And a lot of it ends up being, look, we want the right regulation for crypto. We've worked hard with policymakers to kind of help them formulate things that will prevent scams, prevent nefarious uses of the technology for things like money laundering and so forth, and then enable the good companies, the companies that are, pro-consumer, helping you own your own data and not have it owned by some monopoly corporation who can exploit it or just lose it, like get broken into. And so you now have identity theft problems and so forth, that can kind of help kind of a fairer economy for creatives, so that there's not a 99% tech rate or take rate on things that you create on social media and these kinds of things. And so like, it's just important to kind of, I think, educate the populace on where every candidate stands on these issues. And so we're really, really focused on that. And I think same true for AI, same true for bio.
I'd also add, I don't maybe talk a little bit more about the election in a moment, but I'd also add, like, it's not actually the case that there's a single party in D.C. that's pro-tech and a single party that's anti-tech.
No, definitely not.
There's not, and by the way, if that were the case, it might make life a lot easier.
Yes.
But it's not the case. And I'll just give a thumbnail sketch of at least what I see when I'm in DC and see if you agree with this. So the Democrats are much more fluent in tech. And I think that has to do with, who their kind of elites are. It has to do with this kind of very long established revolving door. And I mean that in both the positive and pejorative sense, between the tech companies and the Democratic Party, Democratic politicians, political offices, congressional offices, White House offices. There's just a lot more integration. The big tech companies tend to be very Democratic, which you see in all the donation numbers and voting numbers. And so there are just a lot more, I would say, tech fluent, tech aware Democrats, especially in powerful positions. Many of them have actually worked in tech companies. Just as an example, the current White House chief of staff is former board member at Meta, where I'm on the board. And so there's just there's a lot of sort of connective tissue between those. Look, having said that, the current Democratic Party, and in particular, certain of its more radical wings, have become extremely anti-tech, to the point of being arguably, in some cases, outright, anti-business, anti-capitalism. And so there's a real kind of back and forth there. Republicans, on the other hand, like, in theory, and the stereotype would have you believe, Republicans are sort of inherently, more pro-business and more pro-free markets, and should therefore be more pro-tech. But I would say there again, it's a mixed bag, because number one, a lot of Republicans just basically think of Silicon Valley that it's all Democrats. And so Silicon Valley is all Democrats. If we're Republicans, that means they're de facto the enemy. They hate us. They're trying to defeat us. They're trying to defeat our policies. And so they must be the enemy. And so there's a lot of, I would say, some combination of distrust and fear, and hate. kind of on that front, and then again with much less connective tissue. There are many fewer, Republican, executives at these companies, which means there are many fewer Republican officials or staffers who have tech experience, and so there's a lot of mistrust. And of course, there have been flashpoint issues around this lately, like social media censorship, that have really exacerbated this conflict. And then the other thing is, there are very serious policy disagreements, and there are at least wings of the modern Republican Party that are actually quite, sort of economically interventionist. And so, so the term of the moment is industrial policy. Yeah, right. Which basically, there are Republicans who are very much in favor of a much more interventionist government approach towards dealing with business, and in particular dealing with tech. And so I guess to say, like, there's real, like, this is not an either or thing. Like, there are real issues on both sides. The way we think about that is that therefore there's a real requirement to engage on both sides. There's a real requirement, Ben, to your point, to educate on both sides. And there's a real, if you're going to make any progress in tech issues, there's a real need to have a bipartisan approach here, because you do have to actually work with both sides.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And just to kind of name names a little, if you look at like the Democratic side, you've got people like Richie Torres out of the Bronx. And, like, by the way, a huge swath of the Congressional Black Caucus that sees, wow, crypto is a real opportunity to equal the financial system, which has, historically been, documentedly racist against kind of a lot of their constituents. And then also, the creatives, which they represent a lot, to kind of get a fair shake. And then on the other hand, you have Elizabeth Warren, who has taken a very totalitarian view of the financial system and is moving to consolidate everything in the hands of, a very small number of banks, and basically control who can participate and who cannot in finance. So, these are just very, very different views out of the same party. And I think that, we need to just make the specific issues really, really clear.
Yeah. And the same thing, we could, spend a long time also naming names on the Republican side. So,
yes.
Yes, which we would do later. But yeah, well, I should do it right now just to make sure that we're fair on this. There are Republicans, there are Republicans who are like full on pro free market, very much pro, are very opposed to all current government efforts to, intervene in markets like AI and crypto. By the way, many of those same Republicans are also very are also very negative any antitrust action. They're very ideologically opposed to antitrust, and so they would also be opposed to things like the Apple lawsuit. That a lot of startup founders might actually like. And then on the flip side, you have folks like Josh Hawley, for example, that are, I would say, quite vocally, I would say, irate at Silicon Valley and very in favor of much more government intervention and control. I think a Hawley administration, just as an example, would be extremely interventionist in Silicon Valley, and would be very, kind of very pro-industrial policy, very much trying to both sort of set goals and sort of have government management of more of tech, but also much more dramatic action against at least perceived or real enemies. So it's the same kind of mixed bag. Yeah. So anyway, that I wanted to go through that, though. This is kind of the long winding answer to the question of how will the upcoming election affect tech policy. Which is, look, there are real issues with the Biden administration, in particular with the agencies and with some of the affiliated senators, as Ben just described. So, there are certainly issues where, the agencies, under the Trump administration, the agencies would be headed by very different kinds of people. Having said that, it's not that a Trump presidency would necessarily be a clean win. And there are many people in sort of that wing who might be hostile by the way, in different ways, or actually might be hostile in some cases in the same ways.
Yeah, and by the way, Trump himself has been quite the moving target on this. He tried to ban TikTok, and now he's very pro TikTok. He has been negative on AI. He was originally negative on crypto, is now positive on crypto. So it's complex, and which is why I think the foundation of all of this is education, and why we're spending so much time in Washington and so forth, is to make sure that we communicate all that we know about technology, so that at least these decisions are highly informed that the politicians make.
Good. Okay, so moving forward, so three questions in one. So Alex asks, as tech regulation becomes more and more popular within Congress, which is happening, do you anticipate a lowering in general of the rate of innovation within the industry? Number two, Tyler asks, what is a key policy initiative that, if passed in the next decade, could bolster the U.S. for a century? And then Elliot Parker asks, what's one regulation that, if removed, would have the biggest positive impact on economic growth? Yeah, so I think that, Ben, see if you disagree with this. I don't know that there's a single regulation or a single law or a single issue. There are certainly individual laws or regulations that are important. But I think the thematic thing is a much bigger problem, the thematic thing is the thing that matters.
The things that are coming are much more serious than the things that have been. I think that's correct. Yeah.
Oh, okay. We'll talk about that. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, so, if you look at the current state of regulation, if it stayed here, there's not anything that we really feel like a burning desire to remove in the same way that things that are on the table could be extremely destructive. And basically, look, if we ban large language or large models in general, or we, force them to go through some kind of, government approval, or if we ban open source technology, that would have just it would basically take America out of the AI game, and, make us extremely vulnerable from a military standpoint, make us extremely vulnerable from a, technology standpoint in general. And so, that's devastating. Similarly, if we don't get kind of proper regulation around crypto, the trust in the system and the business model is going to fade, or is going to kind of be in jeopardy, in that it's not going to be the best place in the world to build crypto companies and blockchain companies, which would be a real shame. The kind of analog would be the kind of creation of the SEC, after the Great Depression, which really helped put trust into the U.S. Capital markets. And I think that, trust into the blockchain system as a way to kind of invest, participate, be a consumer, be an entrepreneur are really, really important and necessary, and very important to get those right.
Okay, and then let's move straight into the specific issues then more. So expand on that. So Lenny asks, what form do you think AI regulation will take over the next two administrations? B. Sakandi asks, will AI regulation result in a concentrated few companies or an explosion of startups and new innovation? E-Ray asks, how would you prevent the AI industry from being monopolized, centralized with just a few tech corps? And then our friend Beth Jesus asks, how do you see the regulation of AI compute and open source models realistically playing out? Where can we apply pressure to make sure we maintain our freedom to build and own AI systems?
It's really interesting because there's like a regulatory dimension of that. And then there's the kind of technological kind of, version of that. And they do intersect. So if you look at what big tech has been trying to do, they're very worried about new competition, to the point where they've taken upon themselves to go to Washington and try and outlaw their competitors. And, if they succeed with that, then I think it is like super concentrated AI power, making the kind of concentrated power of social media or search or so forth, like kind of really pale in comparison. I mean, it would be very dramatic if there were only 3 companies that were allowed to build AI. And that's certainly what they're pushing for. So I think in one regulatory world where big tech wins, then there's very few companies doing AI, probably, Google, Microsoft, and Meta. And, Microsoft, having, basically full control of OpenAI, as they kind of demonstrated. They have the source code, they have the way to, Satya went as far as saying that, we own everything. And then they also kind of control who the CEO is, as they demonstrated, beautifully. So, if you take that, it will all be owned by, 3, maybe 4 companies. If you just follow, though, the technological dimension, I think what we're seeing play out has been super exciting, in that we were all kind of wondering, would there be one model that ruled them all? And even within a company, I think we're finding that there's no current architecture that's going to gain, on a single thing, a transformer model, a diffusion model, and so forth, that's going to become so smart in itself that once you make it big enough, it's just going to know everything, and that's going to be that. What we've seen is, even the large companies are deploying a technique called a mixture of experts, which kind of implies, you need different architectures for different things. They need to be integrated in a certain way, and the system has to work. And that just opens the aperture for a lot of competition because there's many, many ways to construct a mixture of experts to architect every piece of that. We've seen, little companies like Mistral field models that are highly competitive with, the larger models very quickly. And then there's other kind of factors like, latency, cost, et cetera, that factor into this. And then there's also good enough, like when is a language model good enough? When it speaks English, when it knows about what things, what are you using it for? And then there's domain specific data. I've been doing whatever medical research for years, and I've got, data around all these kinds of genetic patterns and diseases and so forth. I can build a model against that data that's differentiated by the data and so on. So I think what we're likely to see kind of a great kind of Cambrian explosion of innovation across all sectors, big companies, small companies, and so forth, provided that the regulation doesn't outlaw the small companies. But that would be my prediction right now.
Yeah, and I'd add a bunch of things to this. So, one is even on the big model side, there's been this leapfrogging thing that's taking place, and so there's OpenAI, GPT-4 was kind of the dominant model not that long ago, and then it's been leapfrogged in significant ways recently by both Google with their Gemini Pro, especially the one with the so-called long context window where you can feed it 700,000 words or an hour of full motion video as context for a question, which is a huge advance. And then the Anthropic, their big model Claude is a lot of people now are finding that to be a more advanced model than GPT-4, and one assumes OpenAI is going to come back, and this leapfrogging will probably happen for a while. So even at the highest end, at the moment these companies are still competing with each other. There's still this leapfrogging that's taking place, and then Ben, as you articulated, very well, there is this giant explosion of models of all kinds of shapes and sizes. Our company Databricks just released another what looks like a big leapfrog on the smaller model side. I think it's the best small model now in the benchmarks, and it's so efficient it will run on a MacBook.
Yeah, and they have the advantage of as an enterprise you can connect it to a system that gives you not only like enterprise quality access control and all that kind of thing, but also it gives you the power to do SQL queries with it, gives you the power to basically create a catalog so that you can have a common understood definition of all the weird corporate words you have. Like, by the way, one of which is customer. Like there's almost no two companies that define customer in the same way. And in most companies, there are several definitions of customer, from is it a department at AT&T? Is it AT&T? Is it, some division of AT&T, et cetera, et cetera.
I think I don't want to literally speak for them, but I think if you put the CEOs of the big companies under truth serum, I think what they would say is their big fear is that AI is actually not going to lead to a monopoly for them. It's going to lead to a commodity. It's going to lead to a sort of a race to the bottom on price. And you see that a little bit now, which is people who are using one of the big models APIs are able to swap to another big model API from another company pretty easily, and then these models, the business model, the main business model for these big models, at least so far, is an API, basically pay per token generated or per answer. And so, like, if these companies really have to compete with each other, like it may be that it actually is a hyper competitive market. It may be the opposite of like a search market or like an operating system market. It may be a market where there's just like continuous competition and improvement and leapfrogging, and then constant price competition. And then, of course, the payoff from that is, to everybody else in the world is like an enormously vibrant market where there's constant innovation happening, and then there's constant cost optimization happening. And then as a customer, downstream of this, the entire world that's going to use AI is going to benefit from this kind of hyper competition. that's going to, could potentially run for decades. And so I think if you put these CEOs in a truth serum, what they would say is that's actually their nightmare. Like
Yeah.
that.
Well, that's why they're in Washington.
That's why they're in Washington. So that is what's actually happening. That is the scenario they're trying to prevent. They are actually trying to shut off competition. And by the way, it actually, I will tell you this. There is a funny thing. Tech is so historically bad at politics that I think some of these folks think they're being very clever in how they go about this. And so, because they show up in Washington with the kind of kind of public service narrative or end of the world narrative or whatever it is, and I think they think that they're going to very cleverly kind of trick people in Washington into giving them a sort of cartel status, and the people in Washington won't realize until it's too late. But it actually turns out people in Washington are actually quite cynical.
They've been lobbied before.
Exactly. And so there is this thing, and then I get this from them off the record a lot, especially after a couple of drinks, which is basically if you've been in Washington for longer than 2 minutes, you have seen many industries come to Washington, many big companies come to Washington and want monopoly or cartel kind of regulatory protection. And so you've seen this, and if you're in Washington, you've seen this play out. In some cases, the guys have been there for a long time, dozens or hundreds of times. And so my sense is like 9 months ago or something, there was a moment where it seemed like the big tech companies could kind of get away with this. I think it's actually, I think actually it's the edges. I'm still concerned and we're still working on it, but I think the edges come off a little bit because I think the cynicism of Washington in this case is actually correct. And I think they're kind of onto these companies. And then, look, if there's a unifying issue, there's basically two unifying issues in Washington. One is they don't like China and the other is they don't like big tech. Yeah. And so, this is a winnable war. Like this is a winnable war on behalf of startups and open source and freedom and competition. And so I'm actually, I'm worried, but I'm feeling much better about it than I was 9 months ago.
Yeah. Well, look, we had to show up. I mean, that's the other thing. I mean, it's taught me a real lesson, which is, you can't expect people to know what's in your head. You've got to go see them. You've got to put in the time. You've got to kind of say what you think. And then, and if you don't have any right to like wring your hands with how bad things are.
Yeah. And then I just wanted to know one more thing just for, says, the Meta, you kind of mentioned the big companies being Microsoft, Google, Meta. It is worth noting Meta is on the open source side of this. And so Meta's actually working quite hard. And this is a big deal because it's very, contrary to the image I think people have of Meta over, in prior issues, correctly or not. But on the open source AI topic and on freedom and innovate, at least for now, Meta is, I think, very strongly on that side. I
think that's right. It's actually a very interesting point and kind of, I think, essential for people to understand is that the way Meta is thinking about this and the way that they're actually behaving and executing is very similar to how Google thought about Android, where, their main concern was that Apple not have a monopoly on the smartphone, not so much that they make money on the smartphone themselves, because, a monopoly on the smartphone for Apple would mean that, Google's other business was in real jeopardy. And so they ended up being kind of an actor for good. And, Android's been an amazing thing for the world, I think, including getting smartphones in the hands of people who wouldn't be able to get them otherwise, all over the world. And Meta is doing kind of a very similar effort where, in order to make sure that they have AI as a great ingredient in their products and services, is willing to open source it and kind of gives all of their very, very kind of large investment in AI to the world, so that, entrepreneurs and everybody can kind of keep them competitive, even though they don't plan to be in the business of AI in the same way that, like Google is in the business of smartphones to some extent, but it's not their kind of key business. And, Meta doesn't have a plan to be in the AI business. Maybe, to some extent they will but that's not the main goal.
And then I would put one other company on the concerning side on this, and it's too early to tell, but where they're going to shake out. But Amazon just announced they're investing a lot more money in Anthropic. So I think they're now basically Amazon is to Anthropic what Microsoft is to OpenAI.
I think that's a possibility. Yep.
Yeah, and so like there's a Anthropic is very much in the group of kind of big tech, kind of new incumbent big tech, lobbying very aggressively for regulation and regulatory capture. in D.C. And so I think it's sort of an open question whether Amazon is going to pick up that agenda as OpenAI, as Anthropic increasingly becomes effectively a subsidiary of Amazon.
Yeah, well, this is another place where we're on the side of Washington, D.C. and the current regulatory motion where, the big tech companies have done this thing, which we thought was illegal because we observed it occur at AOL and people went to jail. But what they've done is they invest in startups, huge amounts of money. Microsoft and Amazon and Google are all doing it, like billions of dollars, with the explicit requirement that those companies then buy GPUs from them at like not the discount that they'd ordinarily get, but at a relatively high price, and then be in their clouds. So that kind of, and then, in the Microsoft case, even more aggressive, give me your source code, give me your weights, which is like extremely aggressive. So, they're moving money from the balance sheet to their P&L, in a way that, at least from an accounting standpoint, it was our understanding wasn't legal. And the FTC is, looking at that now, but it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, well, the other is that's one area. Another issue, that people should watch is, that's one that's around tripping. The other one is just consolidation. If you own, half of a company, and you get to appoint the management team, is that not a subsidiary? There are rules on that. Like at what point you
own the company equity, you own the intellectual property of the company, and you control the management team. Yeah. Is that not your company?
Yeah. And then at that point, if you're not consolidating it, is that legal? And so the SEC is going to weigh in on that. And then, of course, to the extent that some of these companies have nonprofit components to them, there's, tax implications to the conversion to for-profit and so forth. And so there's a lot of, the stakes in the legal, I would say the stakes in the legal, regulatory, and political game that's being played here, I think are quite high.
Quite high. Yes.
Yeah.
Extreme.
Ben and I, as Ben mentioned this, Ben and I are old enough where we do know a bunch of people who've gone to jail. So some of these issues turn out to be serious. So Gabriel asks, what would happen if there was zero regulation of AI, the good, the bad, and the ugly? And this is actually a really important topic. So we're vigorously arguing, in DC, that there should be, basically anybody should be completely capable of building AI, deploying AI. Big companies should be allowed to do it. Small companies should be allowed to do it. Open source should be allowed to do it. And look, a lot of the regulatory pushes we've been discussing that comes from the big companies and from the activists is to prevent that from happening and put everything in the hands of the big companies. So we're definitely on the side of freedom to innovate. Having said that, that's not the same as saying no regulations of anything ever. And so we're definitely not approaching this with kind of a hardcore libertarian lens. The interesting thing about regulation of AI is that it turns out when you kind of go down the list of the things that I would say reasonable people, thoughtful people consider to be concerns around AI on both sides of the aisle. Basically, the implications that they're worried about are less the technology itself, and are more the use of the technology in practice, either for good or for bad. And so, Ben, you brought up, for example, if AI is making decisions on things like granting credit or mortgages or insurance, then there are very serious policy issues around how those answers are derived at, which groups are affected in different ways. The flip side is, if AI is used to plan a crime, or to, plan a bank robbery or something like that, or a terrorist attack, that's obviously something that people focused on national security, law enforcement are very concerned about. Look, our approach on this is actually very straightforward, which is, it seems like completely reasonable to regulate uses of AI, in things that would be dangerous. Now, the interesting thing about that is, as far as I can tell, and I've been talking to a lot of people in DC about this, as far as I can tell, every single use of AI to do something bad is already illegal under current laws and regulations. And so it's already illegal to be discriminatory in lending. It's already illegal to redline in mortgages. It's already illegal to plan bank robberies. It's already illegal to plan terrorist attacks. These things are already illegal, and there's decades or centuries of case law and regulation, and law enforcement and intelligence capabilities around all of these. And so to be clear, we think it's completely appropriate that those authorities be used. And if there are new laws or regulations needed due to, other bad uses, that makes total sense. but that basically the issues that people are worried about can be contained and controlled to the level of the use, as opposed to somehow saying, by the way, as some of the doomer activists do, we need to literally prevent people from, doing linear algebra on their computers.
Yeah. Well, I think that's important to point out, like, what is AI? And it turns out to be, it's math, and specifically kind of like a mathematical model. So you can think of it, for those of you who study math in school, in math, you can have an equation like, y equals x squared plus b or something. And that equation can kind of model the behavior of something in physics or, something in the real world. And so that you can predict, something happening, like the speed that an object will drop or so forth and so on. And then AI is kind of that, but with huge computer power applied, so that you can have much bigger equations with, instead of 2 or 3 or 4 variables, you could have, 300 billion variables. And so if you get into the challenge with that, of course, is if you get into regulating math and you say, well, math is okay up to a certain number of variables, but then at the, 2 billionth and first variable, then it's dangerous. Then you're in a pretty bad place, and that you're going to prevent everything good from the technology from happening, as well as anything that you might think is bad. So you really do want to be in the business of regulating the kind of applications of the technology, not the math. In the same way that, you wouldn't have wanted to, like, nuclear power is very potentially dangerous, as nuclear weapons are extremely dangerous. You wouldn't want to kind of put parameters around what physics you could study in order to, like literally in the abstract, in order to kind of prevent somebody from getting a nuke. Like, you can no longer study physics in Iran, because then you might be able to build a nuke, would be kind of the conclusion. And, that has been kind of what big tech has been pushing for, not because they want safety, but because, again, they want a monopoly. And so I think we have to be very, very careful not to do that. I do think there will probably be, some cases that come up that are enabled by AI, new applications that do need to be, regulated potentially. For example, I don't know that there's a law that, like, if you recreate like something that sounds exactly like Drake, and then you kind of put out a song that sounds like a Drake song, like, I don't know that that's illegal. Maybe that should be illegal. I think those things need to be considered, for sure. And, there's certainly danger in that. I also think we need technological solutions, not just regulatory solutions, for things like deepfakes, that kind of help us get to, what's human, what's not human. And interesting, a lot of those are kind of, viable now based on kind of blockchain crypto technology.
Yeah, so let's just on the voice thing real quick. Yeah, so it actually, I believe this to be the case. It is not currently possible to copyright a voice.
Yeah.
Right. You can copyright lyrics, and you can copyright music, and you can copyright tunes.
Yeah.
Right, melodies and so forth.
Right.
Copyright a voice. And yeah, that seems like a perfect example where that it seems like that probably is a good idea to have a law that lets you copyright your voice.
Yeah, I feel that way. Particularly if people call their voice Drake squared or something, right? Like, it could get very dodgy.
Although again, you get it's just the details. Trademark. You can trademark your name. So you could probably prosecute on that. But by the way, having said that, look, this also gets to the complexity of these things. There is actually an issue around copywriting a voice, which is, okay, well, how close to the voice of Drake does, like, there are a lot of people who have like a lot of voices in the world, and like, how close do you have to get before you're violating copyright? And what if my natural voice actually sounds like Drake? Like, am I now in trouble?
Right. And do I outlaw, like, Jamie Foxx imitating Quincy Jones and that kind of thing, right?
Exactly. So anyway, yeah. Look, I agreeing violently with you on this is like, that seems like a great topic that needs to be taken up and looked at seriously from a legal standpoint. That is actually, is obviously sort of an issue that's sort of elevated by AI, but is a general kind of concept of, like, being able to copyright and trademark things, which has a long history in U.S. law.
Yeah, oh, for sure.
Yeah. So let's talk about the decentralization and the blockchain aspects of this. I want to get into this. So Goose asks, how important is the development of decentralized AI? And how can the private sector catalyze prudent and pragmatic regulations to ensure U.S. retains innovation leadership in this space? So yeah, let's So let's talk about let's talk about decentralized AI, and then I'll highlight real quick, and then you can build on it. Decentralized AI, like the sort of default way that AI systems are being built today is with basically supercomputer clusters in a cloud. And so you'll have a single data center somewhere that's got 10,000 or 100,000 chips, and then a whole bunch of systems to interconnect them and make them all work. And then you have a company, that basically owns and controls that, and these companies, AI companies, are raising a lot of money to do that now. These are very large scale, centralized, kinds of operations. And to train a state of the art model, you're at $100 million plus. To train a big one, to train a small one like the Databricks model that just came out, it's like on the order of $10 million. And so that these are large centralized efforts. And by the way, we all think that the big models are going to end up costing $1 billion, and up in the future. And so then this raises the question of, like, is there an alternate way to do this? And the alternate way to do this is we believe strongly, is with a decentralized approach, and in particular with a blockchain based approach. It's actually the kind of thing that the blockchain Web3 kind of method, seems like it would work with very well. And in fact, we are already backing companies and startups that are doing this. And then I would say there's at least three kind of obvious layers that you could decentralize that seem like they're increasingly important. So one is the training layer. Let me say four. There's the training layer, which is building the model. There's the inference layer, which is the running the model to answer questions. There's the data layer. Ben, to your point on opening up the black box of where the data is coming from, which is there should probably be a blockchain-based system where people who own data can contribute it for training of AIs and then get paid for it, and where you track all that. And then there's a fourth that you alluded to, which is deepfakes. It seems obvious to us that the answer to deepfakes, and I should pause for a second and say, in my last 3 months of trips to D.C., the number one issue politicians are focused on with AI is deepfakes.
The election.
It's the one that directly affects them. And I think every politician right now who's thought about this has a nightmare scenario of, it's 3 days before their reelection campaign, 3 days before the vote, and a deepfake goes out with them, saying something absolutely horrible, and it's so good, and the voters get confused, and and then they lose the election on that. And so I would say, like, that's actually the thing. That's the thing that actually has the most potency right now. And then, what basically a lot of people say, including the politicians, is, so therefore we need basically a way to detect deepfakes. And so either the AI systems need to watermark AI generated content so that you can tell that it's a deepfake, or you need these kind of scanners, like the scanners that are being used in some schools now to try to detect that something was AI generated. Our view, as I would say, both technologists and investors in the space, is that the methods of detecting AI generated content after the fact are basically not going to work. And they're not going to work because AI is already too good at doing this. And by the way, for example, if you happen to have kids that are in a school and they're running one of these scanner programs that is supposed to detect whether your kid is submitting an essay that or use ChatGPT to write the essay, like, those really don't work in a reliable way. And there's a lot of both false positives and false negatives off of those that are very bad. So those are actually very bad ideas. And for the same reason, like detection of AI generated photos and videos and speech is not going to be possible. And so our view is you have to flip the problem. You have to invert the problem. And what you have to do instead is basically have a system in which real people can certify that content about them is real.
And where content has provenance as well, where you
so go ahead, Ben, go ahead and describe how that would work.
Yeah. So, we have, one of the amazing things about crypto blockchain is it deploys something known as a public key infrastructure, which enables kind of every human to have a key that's unique to them, where they can sign. So, like, if I was in a video or in a photo, or I wrote something, I can certify that, yes, this is exactly what I wrote, and you cannot alter it to make it into something else. It is just exactly that. And then, as that thing, gets transferred through the world, let's say that it's something, like a song that you sell and so forth, you can track, just like with, in a less precise way, but with a work of art, we track the provenance, or with a house, who owned it before you and so forth. That's also like an easy application on the blockchain. And so that, kind of combination of capabilities can make this whole kind of program much more viable in terms of, like, okay, knowing what's real, what's fake, where it came from, where it started, where it's going, and so forth. Kind of going back, the data one, I think, is really, really important in that, these systems, one of the things that they've done that's, I would say, dodgy, and, there have been like big pushback against it with, Elon trying to lock down Twitter, and the New York Times suing OpenAI and so forth. These systems have gone out and just slurped in data from all over the internet and all over kind of, people's businesses and so forth, and train their models on them. And, you know, I think that there's a question of whether the people who created that data should have any say in whether the model is trained on that data. And blockchain is an unbelievably great system for this because you can permission people to use it. You can charge them a fee. It can be all automated in a way where you can say, sure, come train, and I think training data ought to be of this nature where there's a data marketplace and people can say, yes, take this data for free. I want the model to have this knowledge, or no, you can't have it for free, but you can have it, or no, you can't have it at all. Rather than, what's gone on, which is this very aggressive scraping. And, like you have these very smart models where these companies are making enormous amounts of money taken from data that certainly didn't belong to them. Maybe it's in the public domain or what have you, but, that ought to be an explicit relationship. And it's not today. And that's a very great blockchain solution, and part of the reason we need the correct regulation on blockchain and we need the SEC to stop harassing and terrorizing, people trying to innovate in this category. And so that's kind of the second category. And then you have like training and inference. And I would say, right now the push against kind of decentralized training and inference is, well, you need this very fast interconnect and you need it to all be in one place technologically. But, and I think that's true for people who have more money than time, right? Which is like, startups and big companies and so forth. But for people in academia who have more time than money, they're getting completely frozen out of AI research. You can't there's not enough money in all of academia to participate anymore in AI research. And so, having a decentralized approach where you can share, all the GPUs across your network. And hey, yeah, maybe it takes a lot longer to train your network or to serve it. But you know what? You still can do your research. You can still innovate, create new ideas, new architectures, and test them out at large scale, which, will be amazing if we can do it. And again, we need, the SEC to stop, kind of illegally terrorizing every crypto company and trying to block laws from being put in place that help us, enable this.
Yeah, there's actually Ben, you alluded to it, the college thing actually really matters. So we have a friend, who runs one of the, is very involved in one of the big computer science programs at one of the major American research universities. And of course, by the way, a lot of the technology we're talking about was developed at American research universities,
Absolutely. Right? And Canadian ones too, Toronto.
And Canadian ones and European ones, exactly. Historically, as with every other wave of technology in the last, 100 years, the research universities, across these countries have been kind of the gems of the well springs of a lot of the new technology that have ended up powering, the economy and everything else around us. We have a friend involved in running one of these, and this friend said a while ago that he said that his concern was that his university would be unable to fund a competitive AI cluster, basically, so a compute grid that would actually let students and professors at that university actually work in AI, because it's now getting to be too expensive, and research and universities are just not funded to have capex programs that big. And then he said his concern more recently has been all research universities together might not be able to afford to do that, which means all universities together might not be able to actually have, basically cutting edge AI work happening on the university side. And then I happen to have a conversation. I was in D.C. I was in a bipartisan, House a meeting the other day with on these AI topics, and one of the in this case Democratic congresswomen asked me, the question which comes up, which is a very serious question always, right? Which is, how do you get kind of more members of underrepresented groups involved in tech? And I found myself giving the same answer that I always give on that, which is you need, the most effective thing you need to do is you need to go upstream, and you need to have more people coming out of college with computer science degrees, who are skilled and qualified and trained right, and mentored in to be able to participate in the industry. And that's you and I, Ben, both came out of state schools, with computer science programs, that where we were able to then have the careers we've had. And so, I find myself answering the question saying, well, we need more computer science, graduates from all from every group. But in the back of my head, I was like, and it's going to be impossible to do that because none of these places are going to be able to afford to actually have the compute resources to be able to actually have AI programs in the future. And so, maybe the government can fix this by just dumping a ton of money on top of these universities, and maybe that's what'll happen. And the current political environment seems like maybe it's not quite feasible for a variety of reasons. And then the other approach would be a decentralized approach, would be a blockchain based approach that everybody could participate in. If that were something that the government were willing to support, which right now it's not. And so I think there's a really, 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 really central, important, vital issue here that I think is being glossed over by a lot of people that I think should really be looked at.
Yeah, no, I think it's absolutely critical. And this is, again, kind of going back to our original thing, like it's so important to the country being what, America being what America should be to get these issues right. And we're definitely in danger of that not happening, because, look, I think people are taking much too narrow a view of some of these technologies and not understanding their full capabilities. And, we get into, the AI could, say something racist, therefore we won't cure cancer. I mean, like we're getting into that kind of dumb idea. And, we need to have a tech forward kind of solution to some of these things. And then the right regulatory approach to kind of make the whole environment work.
So yeah, let's go into the next phase of this now, which is the sort of global implications. So, I'm going to conjoin two different topics here, but I'm going to do it on purpose. So Michael Frank Martin asks, what could the U.S. do to position itself as the global leader of open source software? Do you see any specific legislation or regulatory constraints that are hampering the development of open source projects? Arda asks similar question, what would an ideal AI policy for open source software models looks like? And then Sarah Holmes asks the China question. Do you think we will end up with two AI tech stacks, the West and China, and ultimately companies will have to pick one side and stay on it? And so, look, I would say that this is where you get to like the really, really big geopolitical long-term issue, which is basically my understanding of things is sort of as follows, which is, basically the for a variety of reasons, technological development in the West is being centralized into the United States, with some in Canada and some in Europe. Although, quite frankly, a lot of the best Canadian and European tech founders are coming to Silicon Valley. Jan LeCun, teaches. Jan LeCun is a hero in France, teaches at NYU and works at Meta, both of which are American institutions. And so they're sort of an American, or let's say American plus European kind of sort of tech vanguard wedge in the world. And then there's China. And really it's actually quite a bipolar situation. I would say, the dreams of tech being fully democratized and spreading, throughout the world have been realized for sure on the use side, but not nearly as much on the entrepreneurship side or the invention side. And again, immigration being a great, virtue, but for the countries that are the beneficiaries of immigration, the other side of that is, it makes it, other countries are going to be less competitive because their best and brightest are moving to the U.S. So anyway, we are in a bipolar tech world. It is primarily a bipolar tech world. It's primarily the U.S. and China. This is not the first time we have been in a bipolar world involving, geopolitics and technology. The U.S. and China have two very different systems. The Chinese system has all of the virtues and downsides of being centralized. The U.S. system has all the virtues and downsides of being more decentralized. There is a very different set of views of the two systems on how society should be ordered and what freedom means, and what people should be able to do and not do. And then look, both the U.S. and China have visions of global supremacy and visions of basically and agendas and programs, to carry forward their points of view on the technology of AI and on the societal implications of AI, throughout the world. And so, there is this Cold War 2. Oh, and then the other thing is just in D.C., it's just crystal clear that there's this now dynamic happening where Republicans and Democrats right now are trying to leapfrog each other every day on being more anti-China. And so, we're not, our friend Neil Ferguson is using the term, I think, Cold War 2.0. Like we're in, whether we want to or not, like we're in Cold War 2.0. Like we're in a dynamic similar to the one was with the USSR. 30, 40, 50 years ago. And to Sarah Holmes's question, it's 100% going to be the case. There are two AI tech stacks. And there are two AI governance models, and there are two AI, deployment, systems, and there are two ways in which AI dovetails into everything from surveillance to smart cities to transportation, self-driving cars, drones, who controls what, who gets access to what, who sees what. The degree, by the way, to which AI is used as a method for population control. There are very different visions, and these are national visions and global visions. And there's a very big competition developing. And it certainly looks to me like there's going to be a winner and a loser. I think it's overwhelmingly in our best interest for the U.S. to be the winner. For the U.S. winner, we have to lean into our strengths. The downside of our system is that we are not as well organized and orchestrated top down as China is. The upside of our system, at least historically, is that we're able to benefit from decentralization. We're able to benefit from competition, from a market economy, from a private sector, right? Where we're able to basically have a much larger number of smart people making lots of small decisions to be able to get to good outcomes, as opposed to having a dictatorial system in which there's a small number of people trying to make decisions. I mean, look, and this is how we won the Cold War against Russia: is our decentralized system just worked better economically, technologically, and ultimately militarily than the Soviet centralized system. And so it just seems like fairly obvious to me that like we have to lean into our strengths. We better lean into our strengths. And because if we think we're just going to be like another version of a centralized system, but without all the advantages that China has with having a more centralized system, that just seems like a bad formula. So yeah, let me pause there and Ben, see what you think.
Yeah, I know for sure. I think that'd be disastrous. And I think this is why it's so clear that if there's one, to answer the question, if there's one regulatory policy that we would enact that would ensure America's competitiveness, it would be open source. And the reason being that, as you said, this enables the largest number of participants to kind of contribute to AI, to innovate, to come up with novel solutions and so forth. And I think that you're right. China's, what's going to happen in China is they're going to pick one because they can. And they're going to kind of drive all their wood behind that arrow in a way that we could never do because we just don't work that way. And they're going to impose that on their society and try and impose it on the world. And, our best counter to that is to put it in the hands of all of our smart people. I have so many smart people from all over the world, from, as we like to say, diversity is our strength. We've got this tremendous different points of view, different, kinds of people in our country. And, the more that we can enable them, the more likely we'll be competitive. And I'll give you a tremendous example of this is, I think if you go back to 2017 and you read any, foreign policy magazine, et cetera, there wasn't a single one that didn't say China was ahead in AI. They have more patents. They have more students going to universities. They're ahead in AI. They're ahead in AI. Like we're behind in AI. And then, ChatGPT comes out and goes, oh, I guess we're not behind in AI. We're ahead in AI. And the truth of it was what China was ahead on was in integrating AI into the government, their one AI into their government in that way. And, look, we're working on doing a better job of that with American Dynamism, but we're never going to be good at that model. That's the model that they're going to be great at, and we have to be great at our model. And if we start limiting that, outlawing startups and outlawing anybody but the big companies from developing AI and all that kind of thing, we'll definitely shoot ourselves in the foot. I would say related, or like another kind of important point, I think, in kind of the safety of the world is, when you talk about two AIs, that's like two AI stacks, perhaps, but it's very important that countries that aren't America, that aren't China, can align AI to their values. And I'll just give you kind of one really important example, which, I've been spending a lot of time in the Middle East. And if you look at the kind of history of, a country like Saudi Arabia, they're coming from a world of fundamentalism and, a kind of set of values that they're trying to modernize. And they've done tremendous things with women's rights and so forth. But, look, there's still the fact that they've got, people who don't want to go to that future so fast, and they need to preserve some of their history in order to not have a revolution or extreme violence and so forth. And we're seeing Al Qaeda re-spark up in Afghanistan and all these kinds of things, which are, by the way, Al Qaeda's real enemy of modern Saudi, just as much as they're an enemy of America. And so if Saudi can't align an AI to the current Saudi values, they could literally spark a revolution in their country. And so it's very important that as we have technology that we develop, that it not be totally proprietary closed source, that it be kind of modifiable by our allies who need to kind of progress at their pace to keep their kind of country safe and keep us safe in doing so. And so this has got great geopolitical ramifications, what we do here. Like if we go to the China model that Google and Microsoft are advocating for, this Chinese model of only a few can control AI, we're going to be in big trouble.
Yeah, and then I just want to close on the open source point because it's so critical. So this is where I say I get extremely irate at the idea of closing down open source, which people in a number of these people are lobbying for very actively. By the way, I will. I'm going to name one more name.
Yeah,
we even have VCs lobbying to outlaw open source, which I find to just be completely staggering. And in particular, Vinod. So Vinod Khosla, who is this is just incredible to me. He's a founder of Sun Microsystems, which was in many ways a company built on open source Unix out of Berkeley, and then itself built a lot of open source, critical open source. And then of course, was the .and .com, which of course, the internet was all built on open source. And Vinod has been lobbying to ban open source AI. And by the way, he denies that he's been doing this, but I saw him do it with my own eyes when the U.S. Congressional China Committee came to Stanford. I was in the meeting where he was with, 20 or 30 congressmen and lobbying actively for this. And so I've seen him do it myself. And, look, he's got a big stake in OpenAI. Maybe it's financial self-interest. By the way, maybe he's a true believer in the dangers. But in any event,
I think he proved on Twitter he was not a true believer in the dangers. I'll get into that. I'll explain that. But yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, even within little tech, even within the startup world, we're not uniform in this, and I think that's extremely dangerous. Open source. Like, what is open source software? Like, open source software is it is quite literally, it's the technological equivalent of free speech, which means it's the technological equivalent of free thought, and it is the way that the software industry has developed to be able to build many of the most critical components of the modern technological world. And then, Ben, as you said earlier, to be able to secure those and to be able to have those actually be safe and reliable, and then to have the transparency, that we've talked about, so that how they work and how they're making decisions, and then to your last point, also so that you can have customized AI in many different environments, so you don't end up with a world where you just have one or a couple AIs, but you actually have like a diversity of AIs with like lots of different points of view and lots of different capabilities. And so the open source fight is actually at the core of this. And of course, the reason why, the sort of people with an eye towards monopoly or cartel want to ban this as open source is a tremendous threat to monopoly or cartel. Like, in many ways is a guarantee that monopoly or cartel can't last. But it is absolutely 100%, required for the furtherance of, number one, a vibrant private sector, number two, a vibrant startup sector. And then right back to the academia point, like without open source, then at that point, university, college kids are just not going to be able to, they're not even going to be able to learn how the technology works. They're just going to be like completely boxed out. And so a world where open source is banned is bad on so many fronts. It's just incredible to me that anybody's advocating for it, but it needs to be, I think this needs to be recognized as the threat that it is.
Yeah. And on Vinod, it was such a funny dialogue between you and he. So like, I'll just give you a quick summary of it. Basically, he was arguing for closed source, you for open source. His core argument was, this is the Manhattan Project, and therefore we can't let anybody know the secrets. And you countered that by saying, well, if this is in fact the Manhattan Project, then is like, is the OpenAI team, locked in a remote location? Do they screen all their like employees very, very carefully? Is it airlocked? Are they, is there super high security? And of course, none of that is close to true. In fact, I'm quite sure they have Chinese nationals working there. Probably some are spies for the Chinese government. There's no any kind of strong security at OpenAI or at Google or at any of these places, anywhere near the Manhattan Project, which is where they built a whole city that nobody knew about. So they couldn't get into it. And, once you caught him in that, he said nothing. And then he says back, well, it costs billions of dollars to train these models. You just want to give that away. Is that good? Is that good economics? Like that was his final counterpoint to you, which basically said, oh yeah, I'm trying to preserve a monopoly here. Like, what are you doing? I'm an investor. And I think that's true for all these arguments.
Well, the kicker, Ben, to that story, the kicker to that is three days later, the Justice Department indicted a Chinese national Google employee,
right,
who stole Google's next generation AI chip designs, which is quite literally the family jewels for an AI program. It's it's the equivalent of stealing if you stretch the metaphor, the equivalent of stealing the design for the bomb. And that Google employee took those chip designs, downloaded them, and took them to China. And by definition, that means took them to the Chinese government, because there's no distinction in China between the private sector and the government. It's an integrated thing. The government owns and controls everything, and so 100% guaranteed that went straight to the Chinese government, Chinese military. And Google, which Google has like a big information security team and all the rest of it. Google did not realize, according to the indictment, Google did not realize that engineer had been in China for 6 months.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, hold on. It gets better. This is the same Google with the same CEO who refused to sell Google proprietary AI technology to the US Department of Defense. So they're supplying China with AI and not supplying the US, which just goes back to, look, if it's not open source, we're never going to compete. We've lost the future of the world right here, which is why, it's the single most important AI issue for sure.
Yeah. And you're not going to lock this stuff up. Like, you're not going to lock it up. Nobody's locking it up. It's not locked up. These companies are security Swiss cheese. And you're not going to, and you could have a debate about the tactical relevance of chip embargoes and so forth, but you're not, the horse has left the barn on this, not least because these companies are without a doubt riddled with foreign assets, and they're very easy to penetrate. And so we just have to be, I would say, very realistic about the actual state of play here. And we have to play in reality, and we have to play in reality. We have to win in reality. And the win is, we need innovation, we need competition, we need free thought, we need free speech, we need to embrace the virtues of our system, and not shut ourselves down in the face of the conflicts that are coming. Another one. Andreas asks, why are US VCs so much more engaged in politics and policy than their global counterparts? And I really appreciate that question, because it basically, if that's the question, then it means that, boy, the VCs outside the U.S. must not be engaged at all, because U.S. VCs are barely engaged.
Yeah.
And then what do you believe the impact of this is on both the VC ecosystem and society in general? And then directly related question, Vincent asks, are European AI companies becoming less interesting investment targets for U.S.-based VCs due to the strict and predictably unpredictable regulatory landscape in Europe? Would you advise early-stage European AI companies to consider relocating to the U.S. as a result?
Great question. Well, I think that it kind of goes back to a little of what you said earlier, which is, in startup world, there's, in the West, there's the United States, and then there's everywhere else. And the United States is kind of bigger than everywhere else combined. And, so it's natural. And look, in these kind of political things, it kind of starts with the leader, and U.S. is the leader in VC. We feel like we're the leaders in U.S. VC, so we need to go to Washington. Until we go, nobody's going, and so that's a lot of the reason why we started things. On European regulatory policy, look, it's I think generally regulatory policy is likely to dictate where you can build these companies. We've seen some interesting things. France turns out to be leading a revolution in Europe on AI regulatory, where they're basically telling the EU to pound sand, and a large reason because they have a company there, Mistral, and, it's a national jewel for the country, and they don't want to give it up because, the EU has some crazy safetyism thing going on there.
Yeah, and I would also note France also, of course, is playing the same role with nuclear policy in Europe.
Yeah.
They're the one
Right,
country in
right.
Europe.
They're the cleanest country. Yeah, probably one of the cleanest countries in the world as a result.
Right, but have been staunchly pro-nuclear and trying to hold off, I think, in a lot of ways, sort of attempts throughout the rest of Europe, and especially from Germany to basically ban civilian
Yeah,
nuclear power.
yeah. In the UK, the UK has sort of been flip flopping on AI policy, and we'll see where they come out. And Brussels has been ridiculous as they've been on almost everything.
Yeah, the big thing I think I note here is there's a really big philosophical distinction. I think it's rooted actually in the difference between traditionally it's been called, I think, the sort of Anglo-American kind of approach to law, and then the continental European approach. And I forget these. It's like I forget the terms for it, but the legal.
Right. There's like common law, and then
civil. I think it's civil law.
Yeah,
common law. So it's basically the difference. Basically, is that which is not outlawed is legal.
Right.
Or that which is specifically not legal is legal, and anything that's not explicitly illegal is outlawed. Right. In other words, like by default, do you have freedom and then you impose the law to have constraints, or by default, do you have no ability to do anything and then the law enables you to do things? And these are this is like a fundamental, like philosophical, legal, political distinction. And then this shows up in a lot of these policy issues with this idea called the precautionary principle, which is sort of a rewording of the sort of traditional European approach, which is basically the precautionary principle says new technologies should not be allowed to be fielded until they are proven to be harmless. Right, and of course, the precautionary principle very specifically is sort of a hallmark of the European approach to regulation, and increasingly, by the U.S. approach. And it specifically, its origin, it was actually described in that way and given that name actually by the German Greens in the 1970s as a means to ban civilian nuclear power. With by the way, with just catastrophic results, and we could spend a lot of time on that. But I think everybody at this point agrees, like including the Germans, increasingly agreed that was a big mistake. That, among other things, has led to basically Europe funding Russia's invasion of Ukraine through the need for imported energy because they keep shutting down their nuclear plants. And so just like a sort of a catastrophic decision, but the precautionary principle has become, like, I would say, extremely trendy. Like, it's one of these things, like, it sounds great, right? It's like, well, why would you want anything to be released in the world if it's not proved to be harmless? Like, how can you possibly be in support of anything that's going to cause harm? But the obvious problem of that is, with that principle, you could have never deployed technologies such as fire, electric power, internal combustion engines, cars, airplanes, the computer, right? Like every single piece of technology we have that powers modern day civilization has some way in which it can be used to hurt people, right? Every single one. Technologies are double-edged swords. There are things, you can use fire to protect your village or to attack the neighboring village. Like, these things can be used in both different ways. And so basically, if we had applied the precautionary principle historically, we would not have, we would still be living in mud huts. We would be just like absolutely miserable. And so the idea of imposing the precautionary principle today, if you're coming from like an Anglo, American kind of, perspective, or from a freedom to innovate, perspective, that's just like incredibly horrifying. Should basically guaranteed to stall out progress. This is very much the mentality of the EU bureaucrats in particular. And this is the mentality behind a lot of their recent legislation on technology issues. France does seem to be the main counterweight against this in Europe. Ben, to your point, like the UK has been a counterweight in some areas, but UK also has, like, I would say, they've received a full dose of this programming.
Yeah, they have that tendency.
Yeah, and they've been in AI in particular. I think they've been on the wrong side of that, which hopefully they'll reconsider. So again, this is one of these things, like this is a really, really important issue, and just the surface level thing of like, okay, this technology might be able to be used for some harmful purpose. Like that, if that is allowed to be the end of the discussion, like nothing new is ever going to happen in the world. Like that will cause us ultimately to stall out completely. And then, if we stall out, that will over time lead to regression and like literally, this is happening. Like the power is going out. Like, German industrial companies are shutting down because they can't afford the power that's resulted from this kind of the imposition of this policy in the energy sector. And so this is a very, very, very important thing. I think the EU bureaucracy is lost on this, and so I think it's going to be up to the individual countries to directly confront this if they want to. Anyway, so I really applaud what France has done, and I hope more European countries join them in kind of being on the right side on this.
Yeah. No, it always is funny to me to hear the EU and like The Economist and these kinds of things say, oh, the EU may not be the leader in innovation, but we're the leaders in regulation. And I'm like, well, you realize those go together. They're like one is a function of the other.
Okay, good. So, and then let's do one more global question. Lap Gong Liang asks, are there any other countries that could be receptive to techno-optimism? For example, could Britain, Argentina, or Japan be ideal targets for our message and mission?
Yes. So we'll, look, we're working on that in Britain. And look, we've got some pretty good reception from the UK government. There's, a lot of very, very smart people there. We're working with them, tightly on their AI and crypto efforts, and we're hoping that's the case. Japan is having spent a lot of time there. Is they've obviously shown that capability, over time, and then there's a lot about the way Japanese society works that holds them back from that at times as well. Without getting into all the specifics, there's they have a very, I would just say, unusual and unique culture that has a great deference for the old way of doing things, which sometimes makes it hard to kind of promote the new way of doing things. I also think, around the world, the Middle East is very, very kind of subject and kind of on board with techno-optimism. The UAE, Saudi, Israel, of course, many countries out there are very excited about these kinds of ideas and taking the world forward and just creating a better world through technology. Which I think that, look, with our population growth, if we don't have a better world through technology, we're going to have a worse world without technology. I think that's very obvious. So it's a very compelling message. And oh, by the way, South America, I should say also. There are a lot of countries who are really embracing techno-optimism now in South America, and that's and some great new leadership there that's pushing that.
Yeah, I would also say if you look at the polling on this, what I think you find is what you could describe as the younger countries are more enthusiastic about technology, and I don't mean younger here literally of when they were formed, but I mean two things. One is how recently they've kind of emerged into what we would consider to be modernity.
Yeah.
And so, for example, to embrace, concepts like democracy or free market capitalism or, innovation generally, or global trade and so forth. And then the other is just quite simply the number of the demographics, the countries with a larger number of people. And those are often, by the way, the same countries, right? They have the reverse demographic pyramid we have, where they actually have a lot of young people. And young people are both, young people both need economic opportunity and are very fired up about new ideas.
Yeah, by the way, this is true in Africa as well, in many African countries, Nigeria, Rwanda, Ghana, where their techno-optimism, I think, is taking hold in a real way. They need, some of them need governance improvements, but they definitely also have young populations. Saudi, I think 70% of the population is under 30. So, just to your point, that very, very, very hopeful in those areas.
Ben Goltra asks, do you think the lobbying efforts by good faith American crypto firms will be able to move the needle politically in the next few years? What areas make you optimistic as it relates to American crypto regulation? Crypto, blockchain, Web3.
Yeah, so I think that I'm hopeful. I'm as hopeful as I've ever been. So there's a bunch of things that have been really positive. First of all, the SEC has lost, I think, 5 cases in a row. So some of their arbitrary enforcement of things that aren't laws is not working. Secondly, there was a bill that passed through the House, or the House Financial Services Committee, which is a very, I would say, good bill on crypto regulation. And, hopefully that will eventually pass the House and the Senate. There's, we've seen Wyoming, I think, adopt really good new laws around DAOs. And so there's some progress there. And then, there's been, we've been working really, really hard to educate members of Congress and the administration on kind of the value of the technology. There are strong opponents to it, as I mentioned earlier, and, that continues to be worrisome. But I I think we're making great progress, and the Fair Shake PAC has done just a tremendous job of kind of backing pro crypto candidates, and with great success. There were 6 different races on Super Tuesday that they backed, and all 6 won. So another good sign.
Yep, good. Fantastic. I hit a couple other topics here quickly to get under the wire. So Father Time asks, can you give us your thoughts on the recent TikTok legislation? If passed, what does this mean for big tech going forward? And so let me give a quick swing at that. So the TikTok legislation being proposed by the U.S. Congress and currently being taken up in the Senate, which, by the way, the President Biden has already said he'll sign it if the Senate and the House pass it. This is legislation that would require a divestment of TikTok from its Chinese parent company ByteDance, and so TikTok would have to be a purely American company or would have to be owned by a purely American company. And then failing that, it would be a ban of TikTok in the U.S. This bill is a great example of the sort of bipartisan dynamic in D.C. right now on the topic of China, which is this bill is being enthusiastically supported by the majority of politicians on both sides of the aisle. I think it passed out of its committee like 50-0, which is basically like it's impossible to get anybody in D.C. to agree on anything right now except basically this. So this is like super bipartisan, and then it's the head of that committee is a Republican, Mike Gallagher, and he worked in a bipartisan way with his committee members, but the Democratic White House immediately endorsed his bill. So like this bill has like serious momentum. The Senate is taking it up right now. They're likely to modify it in some way, but it seems reasonably likely to pass based on what we can see. I would say, like I said, by overwhelmingly bipartisan support. And look, the argument for the ban is, I would say, in a couple different ways, or not the divestment of the ban. Number one is just like an app on Americans and on the phones of of a large percent of Americans with surveillance and potential propaganda kind of aspects of that. Certainly has people in Washington concerned. And then, quite frankly, there's an underlying industrial dynamic, which is the U.S. internet companies can't operate in China, so there's a sort of an unfair asymmetry underneath this that really undercuts I think a lot of the arguments for ByteDance. It has been striking to see that there are actually opponents of this bill who have emerged, and I would describe on sort of the further to the right and further to the left in their respective parties. Those folks, and I won't go through detail, but those folks make a variety of arguments. One of the, and let me characterize at least the surface level. I think on the further on the left, I think that there are people who think that, it's especially kind of further left Congress people who feel like TikTok is actually a really important and vital messaging system for them to be able to use with their constituents who tend to be younger and very internet centric. And so there's that, which is interesting. But then on the further on the right, there is a lot, and our friend David Sachs, for example, might be an example of this. There are a fair number of people who are very worried that the U.S. government is so prone to abuse any regulatory capability with respect to tech, and especially with respect to censorship, that basically if you hand the U.S. government any new regulatory authority or legal authority at all to come down on tech, it will inevitably be used not just against the Chinese company, but it will also then be used against the American companies. And so, it's there's some drama that's surfacing around this, and we'll see whether the opponents can kind of pull it through. Look, quite frankly, I without coming down particularly on, I think there's one of those cases where there's actually like excellent arguments like on all three sides. Like I think there are like very legitimate questions here, and so I think it's great that the issue is being confronted, but I think it's also great that the arguments have been surfaced and that we're going to hopefully figure out the right thing to do. Couple closing things. Close on, let's see, hopefully a semi-optimistic note. So John Potter asks, how do you most effectively find common ground with groups and interests that you benefit from working with, but with which you are usually opposed ideologically or otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, there's this term in Washington, common ground. And I think that, you always want to start by finding the common ground, because I'll tell you something in politics generally is most people have the same intention. Like in Washington, in fact, people want life to be fair. They don't want people to go hungry. They want, citizens to be safe, but have plenty of opportunity. So like, there's a lot of common ground. The differences lie not in the intent, but how you get there. Like, what is the right policy to achieve the goal. And, so I think it's always important to start with the goal and then kind of work our way through, why we think our policy position is correct. Like we don't really have a lot of disagreements on stated intent, at least. I mean, I think there are some intentions that are very difficult in Washington. Like the intention to kind of control the financial system is from the government, or nationalize the banks, or kind of achieve the equivalent of nationalizing the banks. Is when you have that intent, that's tough. But like if you start with most intentions are, I think, shared between us and policymakers on both sides.
And then we'll close on this great question. Zach asks, would either of you ever consider running for office? And for fun, what would be your platform?
So I want just because, look, I think being a politician requires a certain kind of skill set and attitude and energy from certain things that I don't possess, unfortunately.
Do you have a platform you would run on if you did run?
Yeah,
I do.
Okay, yeah. Let's hear your platform.
The American Dream.
Yeah.
So I won't do it now, but I like to put up this chart that shows the change in prices in different sectors of the economy over time. And what you basically see is the price of like television sets and software and video games are like crashing hard, right? In a way that's like great for consumers. I saw 75-inch flat screen, ultra high def TVs now are down below $500. Like, you just like, it's great. It's amazing. Like when technology is allowed to work its magic, like prices crash in a way that's just great for consumers. And it's equivalent of a giant, basically, when prices drop, it's equivalent of a raise. So it makes human welfare a lot better. The three elements of the economy that are central to the American dream are healthcare, education, and housing. Right. And so if you think about what does it mean to have the American dream, it means to be able to buy and own a home. It means being able to send your kids to great schools, get great education, to have a great life. And then it means, great healthcare, to be able to take care of yourself and your family. The prices on those are skyrocketing. They're just like straight to the moon. And of course, those are the sectors that are the most controlled by the government. Where there's the most subsidies for demand from the government. There's the most restrictions on supply from the government. And there is the most interference with the ability to field technology and startups. And the result is we have an entire generation of kids who basically, I think, are quite rational and looking forward and basically saying, I'm never going to be able to achieve the American dream. I'm never going to be able to own a home. I'm never going to be able to get a good education or send my kids to good education. I'm not going to be able to get good healthcare. Basically, I'm not going to be able to live the life that my parents lived or my grandparents lived. And I'm not going to be able to fundamentally form a family and provide for my kids. And I think in my opinion, that's the underlying theme to kind of what has gone wrong, sort of socially, politically, psychologically in the country. That's what's led to the sort of intense level of pessimism. That's what's led to sort of this attraction, kind of very zero-sum politics to, recrimination over optimism and building. And so I would confront that absolutely directly. And then of course I would point out that I don't think anybody in Washington is doing that right now. So. No. Either I would win because I'm the only one saying it out loud, or I would lose because nobody cares. But I think it would. I've always wondered whether that actually would whether both on the substance and on the message, whether that would be the right platform.
Yeah, no, it would certainly be the thing to do. That's the thing. It's very complex in that healthcare policy is largely national, but education policy and housing policy has also got a very large local component. So it'd be a complicated set of policies that you'd have to enforce. Yeah.
We still have a ton of questions, so we may do part 2 on this at some point, but we really appreciate your time and attention, and we will see you soon.
Okay. Thank you.